So what's up with the rapture anyways? Is it a nice little ideology that some Christians believe in? Or is it an attempt to weaponize prophecy and steer humanity towards its final destruction?
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
Network containers, that's how supposedly the aliens look at us.
It would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, of new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but are inwardly ravenous wolves. That's Jesus teaching a crowd in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7. And that's where we get our famous saying, a wolf in sheep's clothing. It gives us the idea that the sheep represent truth, and the false prophet represents teaching that has truth in it and the appearance of truth, but is inwardly meant to deceive. Another way of describing it is something that appears harmless, trustworthy, or virtuous on the outside, but is actually deceitful, malicious, or dangerous in their true intentions. And so often with religious type teachings, and when people begin to feel gypped or that they've been lied to by religion, it's not so much that it's all complete lies, but that they've taken virtuous and true things, and that the core intent is meant not for the advancement of humanity, but to kind of stall. I think of it as a type of a mind leash. You can only get so far, and then that leash pulls you back. And I know a thing or two about a mind leash. Mine almost killed me. It took me almost 30 years to get disconnected from that thing. So what's the wolf in sheep's clothing I'm going to talk about today? What is the teaching that has true things, but the core intention of that teaching is meant to manipulate people into doing what they want? Well, that would be the rapture. Of course, the rapture is a teaching that is embraced by, in my experience, mostly evangelicals. It's a huge part of their theology, and I used to be one. And when I was, I never liked it. I never gave it any energy. And I've talked about it in other podcasts, especially the Chris Bledsoe one. I share my story of walking through my fear of the rapture. And if you're not super familiar with the rapture teaching, I'll give you a quick breakdown. It's basically the teaching that in the end times, which is, well, it kind of looks like it's right now, but in the end times, Jesus is going to come back to earth and appear in the sky, and the trumpet is going to blow, and all of the Christians will instantly disappear and be caught up into heaven. And then God's judgment is going to be brought out on earth, and millions of people are going to die. And anyone that was not caught up into heaven for the rapture will burn in hell for all eternity. Now, that's the way it was taught to me in the 80s. And like everything, things evolve, teachings evolve over the years. And I'm not sure if they still believe the rapture will happen exactly that way, or at least I hope they don't. But with a quick Google search here, it says that there's about 90 to 100 million Americans that are evangelical Christians, which is about 30 to 35% of the U.S. population. And you think, well, big deal. So 90 to 100 million people think that Jesus could come back at any moment and rapture them, and the earth will go into complete destruction. You know, it's just a worldview. Everybody has a worldview, and it's harmless, right? Well, it's fine when the average regular Joe, like probably most of the people listening to this podcast right now, it's fine when normies like us think that. But what about when you get into a position of power and influence? What about then? Do you want someone steering your national government who thinks that Christians are going to be raptured and the earth is going to be destroyed? Because I remember a saying in the 80s that I would hear people say in that Christian community I was a part of. And at the time, it had to do with recycling. And I heard some people say here and there of, who cares about recycling? It's all gonna burn anyways. If the earth is gonna be destroyed, why put so much effort into preserving it? Now, when a normie like us thinks something like that, I mean, it's not the best way of thinking at all. But what about when world leaders think like that? What about when powerful military or politicians buy into that ideology? How does that affect their leadership and the choices that they make for their nation? Now hold that thought, and we're going to dig into where did the rapture come from and how long have people believed it? I mean, I just assumed that people believed in that version of the rapture from the time that Jesus walked the earth. But that's not the case. Before the late 1800s, they believed in the end times all right, but it didn't have such a negative twist to it. They believed that there would be a final judgment, a resurrection of the dead, but that there would be a renewal of creation. It was not fear-driven, but it was hope-filled. And they had more of the thought of spiritual endurance and not avoiding some catastrophe tribulation. They believed that the return of Christ would bring restoration, a new heaven and a new earth. The earth wasn't something to be abandoned. It was something to be redeemed and renewed. And I read somewhere a little while ago that the idea among the average Protestant Christian was that by being a better person and loving people and the earth, that's what would bring Christ back. Now that is a worldview, belief system, ideology that you want your world leaders to have. And a key thing here is that they did not see the church in Israel as two separate entities. But that idea started to change in about 1830, and it was from an Anglo-Irish preacher named John Nelson Darby. He began teaching what became known as dispensationalism. He claimed that human history was divided into dispensations or distinct periods in which God related to humanity in different ways. He introduced the idea that before the final tribulation, true Christians would be removed from earth, essentially a secret rapture. Now, some researchers argue that Darby was influenced by a girl named Margaret MacDonald from Scotland, and that she had a vision which included a separation of believers before judgment. So Darby went around preaching this message. And by the mid-1800s, he made it to America, and he started teaching around Protestant and evangelical churches. His theology began gaining traction, especially in the fundamentalist circles. But what really cemented this teaching into society and the culture was something called the Scofield Reference Bible. Now, this Bible, published in 1909, it had extensive footnotes that interpreted biblical prophecy through this dispensationalist, rapture-based lens. It became wildly influential in American evangelical churches. And for many of the readers, they treated these footnotes as the exact interpretation of Scripture. The Scofield Bible linked Israel's restoration, end times prophecy, and rapture theology, and that formed the backbone of the modern Christian Zionism that we know today. But things really took off with that teaching in the 1970s and 1980s. There was a book that I had read called The Late Great Planet Earth by a guy named Hal Lindsey. And it's a very well-written book, and he just breaks down the theology and how it links with the land of Israel and how Israel is the fulfillment of prophecy and how Jesus is going to return and there's going to be an end-time Armageddon war and on and on and on. And then, in 1990, a series of books came out called Left Behind by a guy named Tim LaHaye. And with a title like that, you can imagine what it's about, being left behind and navigating through Armageddon and the tribulation. Wonderful. But the problem is, these books influenced millions and millions of people, including me. And it was really a fear-based narrative. And the problem is, when millions and millions of people buy into a fear-based belief that affects their worldview, which affects how they vote. So a whole bunch of people convinced that there's going to be some major end-time war, I would think that would be good for the defense companies. They need people to be afraid. When you're afraid, you want to be protected. You can see how this ideology can be good for business. And without this ideology, I don't think Israel would have ever come into existence. Christian Zionists came to believe that supporting the modern state of Israel was fulfilling biblical prophecy. Many dispensationalists taught that the return of the Jews to Israel was a precondition for the rapture and the second coming of Christ. So right there, you have a prophecy that is now crossed the line and stepping over into the political arena. This created political alliances between evangelical leaders and Zionist organizations, including the Israeli government. In other words, rapture theology primed Christians to support Zionism, not because of politics, but because of prophecy. Many Christian media, churches, and ministries promote rapture and end times narratives that align with the Israeli state government. Israeli leaders have acknowledged that Christian Zionists are some of their most loyal supporters, especially in U.S. policy. And this support is often rooted not in love for Judaism, but in the belief that Israel plays a necessary role in ushering in Armageddon. Now, I've been out of this for a little while, but I'm pretty sure that they believe that Jesus will come back, they'll go up into heaven, the tribulation will happen, and the Jews that don't accept Jesus as the Messiah will be destroyed. So that's clearly no love for Judaism there. So it's not that Zionism invented the rapture theology, but they have used it and funded it for their own political purposes. You know, there is a deep difference between spiritual truth and weaponized prophecy used to drive geopolitical agendas. Which brings us back to the wolf in sheep's clothing, a teaching that seems harmless on the outside, but has very dangerous intentions. Another way to describe it is evil masquerading as innocence or righteousness. Now, there's a guy that I talk about from time to time, Dr. Michael Heiser. He was a theologian and Semitic language expert. He doesn't really buy in to this rapture ideology the way the evangelicals do. I used to listen to his podcast all the time called The Naked Bible. And he told a story once about how he was at a major Christian book publishing company. And he was sitting in the office with the editor of the Left Behind series. And he told him how he doesn't think the Left Behind point of view on the rapture is correct at all, and it's totally wrong. And the editor agreed with him. And he was shocked. He couldn't believe that somebody who doesn't believe in it, but their job is promoting something that influences millions of Christians. And his point was, just because there's some popular ideology out there doesn't mean the people that are promoting it actually believe in it. And his point was that people have to do their own research on what they believe, because you can't rely on somebody else. And that's something that I say and think all the time. Where did we get our beliefs from? Are they from our own conclusions, or did somebody tell us? And the person that told us that, did they get that belief from their own conclusions, or was it something that somebody told them? Now, something that I like to do is follow the paper trail of an idea. In this day and age with the internet, pretty much everybody in the world can do it. Take an idea and try to figure out where that came from. Like, for instance, what I did with the rapture. I had just assumed that Christians had always believed that for 2,000 years, but it turns out that wasn't the case. I followed the paper trail, and it wasn't very hard. Like about 3 minutes of Googling, and I came across John Darby. And another whole paper trail I was following was the book of Revelation. They use a lot of it in their rapture end-time theology. And I came across something that was very interesting. For me, the book of Revelation comes down to one key point. When was it written? Was it written before AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome, or after? Now, the popular view among evangelicals is that it was written after. But they have to believe that, because they're saying that the Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation and it was pertaining to today. Because the kicker is, if he wrote the book of Revelation before AD 70, that would mean that he was writing that book and it was a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, which kind of makes a lot more sense. And in me pulling the thread on that one, following the paper trail, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it was written before AD 70, and that the true intent of the book is to warn about this coming huge event, which would kind of make sense. The disciples, the guys that walked with Jesus, that healed people, that had prophetic insight and went to heaven, it fits that they would have some type of foreknowledge about the destruction of Jerusalem and want to write a book warning people. But for normies like us, it's pretty easy to change our mind. But what about people that work in this industry? People that work for the publishing companies that promote the Left Behind series and other books like that. Or people that work in Christian ministries promoting Zionism and the state of Israel. If they change their mind, they would have to quit their job. It would be a very difficult position to be in. Reminds me of the old saying, it's easier to fool someone than to convince them they've been fooled, especially when your livelihood is attached to it. And right now, we are at a monumental place in history. The age is changing from Pisces to Aquarius. So we are literally at the end of the age. Wars are raging around the earth, especially the Middle East. And, like I always say, anyone who knows me knows I have the ability to take any subject and bring that back to aliens. And this reminds me of what I talked about in episode 4, the message of Chris Bledsoe. Chris Bledsoe was contacted by what he calls the phenomenon, or the lady. She told him that the earth was going to go through a huge, massive shift, an awakening. But before that would happen, that there's going to be trouble, that the elites or ruling powers of the earth were using biblical, quote-unquote, prophecy as a script, and that they were following that to direct humanity into a third world war. And he was told that Israel was going to bomb Syria and Iran. But the good news is that it's not going to work. That divine feminine is returning to earth. And we're going to have 1,000 years of peace. And I had heard him say that a few years ago. And I thought to myself, I wonder how that would play out. I wonder how that's going to work. How are they going to use biblical prophecy to try and bring about the end of the world? Well, I'm not wondering how anymore. It's pretty easy to see. This 120-year-old rapture ideology has influenced millions of Christians who see modern-day Israel as a fulfillment of prophecy, which to them means Jesus could come back at any second. And so naturally, they want to vote for political leaders who will support Israel because that is part of end-time prophecy. So there is a merger of faith and political there. And Israel is surrounded by all of their, quote, enemies, so they need to be supported. So they vote for politicians who will send mass amounts of money and military aid, which is fueling this war that's going on right now. But things are starting to change. Israel is losing favor around the world. The tide is starting to turn, and they're being increasingly more and more abandoned, which is not good. They have nuclear weapons, and they also have something called the Samson option. Now, the Samson option, it's a term used to describe Israel's nuclear deterrence strategy. It's a last resort if the nation faces existential destruction. Of course, it's named after the biblical character Samson, who brought down a Philistine temple, killing himself and his enemies. And that's not good, because it implies Israel would use its nuclear arsenal to potentially destroy the region or even the earth. I've heard some people talk about that they would be willing to plunge the earth into a nuclear winter. Now, this concept emerged in the 1960s, and people attribute it to leaders like David Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres. Now, they said it was primarily deterrence and not for revenge. But when I keep in mind what the lady told Chris Bledsoe, I could see how this is the plan that the elites have. And to bring the weirdness here up another notch, if you've listened to some of my Thought Tub Revelations episodes, you'd know that my whole life I've heard psychic-type voices, and sometimes I hear stuff that comes true. Well, about 1.5 years ago, I woke up in the morning, and in my head, it's like I woke up in mid-conversation. And in my head, I was having a conversation with somebody, and I was saying this. The reason the war's going on in the Middle East is because Israel has the Ark of the Covenant? And I'm laying there thinking, what the hell was that? You know, the average person that has that happen would just assume they ate too much pizza the night before. But when that happens to me, with my track record of hearing stuff sometimes that comes true, I wonder. So I guess we'll see if there's any truth to that, or I ate too much pizza. Who knows? Now I realize that this is all very doom and gloom, especially right now with everything going on. But there's a silver lining on this cloud. The rapture theology, it isn't all wrong. When you strip the entire thing down into its simplest form, they're saying that at the end of the age, something's going to happen. Something huge is going to happen. And they're right. I think it does have something to do with Jesus. But not a man physically coming back in the clouds, but something much deeper. The return of Christ consciousness to the human race. So we will ascend in a way, but consciously ascend. And there will be some who choose not to consciously ascend. And they will be left behind. However that looks and whatever form it takes, I think there's something to that. Maybe you could all boil it down to those who choose love, and there will be those who choose fear. And this fits a pattern among all types of different religions and belief systems, that they too say that something huge is going to happen at the end of the age. And back to John Nelson Darby, the guy that made the Rapture theology famous, and how I had mentioned that he had heard it from a teenage girl, Margaret MacDonald, who had a prophetic vision that there would be some type of separation of believers before judgment. I think she was probably onto something. It just all depends how we see it. And when we look at that through the lens of our belief systems, it gets distorted. So I think that there is good news. But in order for humanity to progress and to clean itself up, so to speak, we have to find out what's actually going on. And that's what we're going through right now, I think. There's a saying in the UFO community about disclosure. They want the government to tell them what's really going on. Well, I think we're in the midst of disclosure right now. But we're going to find out about a lot more things than just UFOs. And I don't think it's the government that's going to disclose it to us. Well, at least not willingly. I think what's going on is more of an exposure. Negative, fear-based type energies are being exposed. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's the divine feminine. Maybe it's cosmic rays coming from galactic center. But either way, it's happening before our eyes. And it seems to be speeding up. Sometimes I think of people who I know that died before 2020. And if I was talking to them right now and they were asking me, so what's happened in the past 10 years on Earth? The amount of bizarre things that I would be telling them is crazy. I'd probably start with, well, there was a worldwide pandemic that shut down the world for a couple years. Not to mention the whole whatever's going on with the Epstein and all the elites and Little St. James Island and bribery. They've had a few UFO hearings in Congress where military officials are talking about they have alien bodies or something. Oh, and don't forget the war between Russia and Ukraine, and some say up to 1 million Ukrainians have been killed. Plus, with everything going on in the Middle East right now, and India and Pakistan fighting, and they're both nuclear nations. And, they found some type of structure underneath the pyramid that goes down at 2,000 feet or something. And a former Bush administration official, Catherine Austin Fitz, was on Tucker Carlson's show a few weeks ago and admitted that the government has spent trillions of dollars on deep underground military bases all over the US, under the ocean, that are interconnected somehow, and that they have 0-point energy technology, and that the government has been hiding it. And those are just mainstream media news stories. So there has been a ton of change. Novelty is increasing. New inventions create upheaval, the uprooting of old systems. Think of the way AI is sweeping the earth and rapidly changing things. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. Heck, even 5 years ago. And I'll show you how much I've changed. I've never cared for the Beatles, or John Lennon for that matter. I've been a metalhead my entire life. And in my teenage years, that's all I listened to. I used to tell people I refuse to listen to music where the person isn't screaming. And a couple years ago, I was working and listening to a podcast, and I can't remember what the podcast was about, but they mentioned something about John Lennon and his song, Imagine, which I've always thought it is the dumbest song. But something had sparked in me, and I knew that I just needed to listen to that song again and to really listen to the words. And as I was listening to the song, my heart was moved. And I had the feeling that this song may be the most prophetic song in human history, especially considering where we are right now. I think that this song is a message from the universe. Because I'm convinced that when we're creative, when we pursue creative acts and expressions, that it's like raising a sail to catch the wind of the gods to propel humanity towards its destiny. And I think that the intention of this song is to do just that. And this is coming from a metalhead. So I'm going to read the lyrics to this song and just try to look at this from an open-minded perspective. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.